Good morning. Thank you all for joining us on the last day. Can you hear me okay? Great. I'm Lynn Wright.
And I'm Daryl Anderson. Hi.
And we are presenting on House Conversations, Police Encounters, and Everyday Racism. Black parents talk about race socialization. So in 2020, at the beginning of the global COVID-19 pandemic and in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, in what was an extremely stressful time across the United States, as our participant Estella notes here, African American mothers began to publicly discuss the work they had to do to prepare their children to live in a racialized and racist society, and the uneven work of being a Black parent in the U.S., as we can see in publications such as Yolanda Conley-Shields' book, and the kind of press that started to emerge on this topic. Several articles about preparing young Black men for encounters with the police or having, quote, the talk, ran in popular publications. Such discussions indicate a need for a deeper understanding of the work associated with parenting Black children in the U.S. and how those in the wider community can support parents. Police encounters are not the only potential sites of racism that young Black children face, and parents in African American families engage in processes of race socialization to prepare their children for life in a racialized and racist society. Race socialization has been defined by Lassane Brown as specific verbal or nonverbal messages transmitted to younger generations for the development of values, attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs regarding the meaning and significance of race and racial stratification, intergroup and intergroup interactions, and personal and group identity. Race socialization has been studied as primarily a language-oriented practice where messages in family conversations are transmitted to children, though it's not always linguistic. Jones and Neblett list the following types of race socialization that can occur. So they point to cultural socialization, preparation for bias, promotion of mistrust, and egalitarianism, individual traits or equity. These messages and race socialization in general have been found to have positive effects for children. So they can protect children from internalizing negative racial stereotypes. They can promote it helps with grades in school, and not talking to children about race leaves them vulnerable and unprepared in race-related situations. However, not all race socialization is beneficial, so those messages that emphasize mistrust without coping strategies can be somewhat detrimental. To our knowledge, there are very few, if any, studies of family race socialization from a discourse analytic or language socialization perspective. Umanya Taylor and Hill point out that in the field of race socialization, which is generally in psychology, sociology, there is still room to understand why and how these topics come up in family conversations and how children take up these messages when their parents discuss them. So taking a language socialization approach and narrative approach can shed light on why, how, and when race socialization takes place in family conversations and the identities constructed in such talk that influence children's sense of belonging and well-being. Language socialization, according to Oakes and Shifflin's expanded 2011 definition, is the examination of how children apprehend the context of situation in relation to the context of culture. The primary focus has typically been on the role language plays as children become competent members of a community or a family. For the families in this study, conversations at home are important to shaping children's participation in potentially racialized events and contexts outside of the home. And so we are also kind of taking a narrative approach to our interview data. Storytelling is a central site of language socialization and family conversations where family members construct identities and moral stances toward each other and the external world. In this study, we focus on the stories that emerge in research interviews as important to parents in their race socialization efforts. So we're looking at the narratives in the interviews and the narratives about the narratives that happened at home. So So just to kind of recap, the study examines how African American parents in a mid-sized city in the southern United States talk about race socialization in interviews, with a specific focus on the construction of family external events and children as active participants, as we look at narratives told in the interviews and the narratives about the narratives. Our questions are: how do Black parents talk about race socialization in interviews? What stories are tellable in a parent's history of race socialization? And what role do children play and media in parent stories about talking about race and racism at home? Sorry.
Thank you. So we employed a language socialization and narrative approach to examine 6 African American parents' beliefs and attitudes towards race socialization. To recruit the participants, we distributed announcements to email lists such as Memphis Parents, the Boys and Girls Club, and other networks specific to Black parents like group organizations of the National Pan-Hellenic Council. We also posted the flyers on social media and at local businesses such as at Starbucks. 34 people completed the pre-interview survey that was used to determine if they met the criteria for the research study, and 6 people actually responded so that we can schedule an interview with them. Within an 8-month period of time, those 6 African American parents followed up with us, scheduled and attended an interview via Zoom. These 6 African American parents who volunteered for the study represent a highly educated and mid to high socioeconomic status within the Memphis population. All participants held at least a bachelor's degree, and most had obtained a doctoral degree. Only one participant by the pseudonym Lene, the single mother whose occupation was a school teacher, solely had a bachelor's degree and made less than $80,000 annually. Only one participant by the pseudonym Estella solely had a master's degree. All other participants, Maria, Alex, Maya, and Betty, held doctoral degrees and made over $100,000 annually. All 6 semi-structured interviews were held via Zoom that were recorded. Only 2 of the participants were interviewed by both of us. The others were one-on-one interviews. One of those interviews was made by request to only be with Glenn, and the other 3 were with me. On average, the discussions last for about 52 minutes. The Zoom interviews were designed to elicit narratives about participants' family conversations and were transcribed by us, the researchers. We were aware that the interviewers' perceived racial identity would shape the interview. As this participant, Lene, noted in her interview with me, she stated, "So if you were doing this interview with me and you were a white person, I wouldn't may have been as frank, especially if I didn't know you." Using Oates and Capps' dimensional approach to narrative, we consider what stories become tellable in parents' history of race socialization and how children emerge as active co-collaborators in these stories themselves. So we look at the tellability of the narrative within the context of the research interview. But the tellership in relation to the conversation at home, for example, when children are constructed in story world as asking questions or bringing up topics about race and racism. After reviewing the transcripts and analyzing the data, we found that the most tellable stories were those about racist events that happened to the participants' children at school, which prompted private house conversations about how to deal with racism. While the parents did report that they talked to their sons in particular about what to do if stopped by the police, perhaps the most tellable stories in the interview were of more everyday racist events at school and in the children's lives. These events were reported to lead to race socialization events at home, as we see in Estella's narrative here, where she had to sit down and talk to her son about his feelings on being a victim of microaggressive behavior from his own school teachers. Similarly, Maya also talked about her son as being treated unfairly in sports because he was seen as a threat. This caused a need to discuss racism at home, and I quote, So very early on, we had conversations with him about being treated differently because he was seen as a threat because he was a dominating, athlete as a black young man. And Lene and her daughter also talked about a racist incident at school during a public event and how her daughter dealt with it. Lene's daughter called a peer racist after her classmate marginalized how much black people struggle and claimed they're not actually struggling. Her comment offended most of the black students in her class. Additionally, Lene shared with me how her daughter had written a letter to the school about their promotion of the Black Lives Matter slogan. Lene expressed that people do not empathize with what our little black boys and girls are dealing with, although we depend on them greatly. Some participants reported the need for house conversations. For example, Estella narrated a time when her child brought up a topic concerning race and the type of conversations black families must have that other races may not necessarily have to have. According to the participant, these conversations only occur between the family as opposed to general conversations. Conversations reserved for the house also came up in Lene's interview when she expressed to her daughter that it's not everybody's business. Everyone doesn't mean well for you. After they were discussing race socializations that Lene received from her parents and aunties about being a black young lady.
So one of the things we also wanted to look for were the identities that were constructed in these stories and in this talk. And we found that mothers in particular saw themselves as protectors and advocates for their children. So mothers talked about sending their children to predominantly white schools and living in white neighborhoods. And this context increased the need for race socialization in the home, and there was a perceived increase. More specifically, several parents constructed themselves as protectors and advocates. So here Maria discusses her son's reaction to an overtly racist comment that was made in an auditorium setting at school. And so he's getting in the car at carpool, she says, and he tells her about it. And so I kind of asked my son, how did you respond? And he said, well, I wasn't really paying attention until I realized what was going on. And I was like, my mother isn't going to like this. And she kind of laughed. So she sees herself here as an observer, a kind of absent observer, and a buffer or protector for her child who can intervene if he needs it. And Maya more kind of proactively talked about intervening in her child's life and checking the white power holders around him. So this was a story where he moved schools and he had to walk home after school and before school in a white neighborhood. And she says, I called the police chief and I said, if a neighbor calls you about a black boy walking down the street, you can tell her that's JJ, right? Here's his name and this is what he is doing. And she had done that, in the interview she talks about doing that over and over in different spaces. And then Maya in particular talked about using a strategy that she called bumper pad parenting. Bumper pad parenting contributes to that where you are giving them space but protecting them. Like with us, with the fraternity situation, this is a different story. I'm letting you leave, but if you hit a bump, I'm gonna be right there to check people, right? And so I think that's important. And here she's shifting the race socialization from her son to the external world around him, right? That the message is to the white people around him and not to him in particular. And then Betty, who identified as African American but also Creole and had a lighter skin tone, said, I hate to say it, Lynn, but it's like my white skin is a shield for my whole family sometimes, so reinforcing the protector role. One of the other things that we wanted to find out was how were these conversations initiated in family conversation. And so parents did talk about their children asking questions or bringing up the topic. We saw the discussion about in carpool, about something that had happened at school, but also Alex here says that his daughter in the course of the conversation I might ask, how's the school day, what's going on, and then it will come up in that way. So there was a lot of, seems, debriefing after school about things that had happened during the day. And then he also talks about watching the news and his own reactions to Ahmaud Arbery, because he had been running in the neighborhood and decided to stop doing that. The intersections of public and private life are another big theme to emerge, especially in relation to being at home because of the pandemic. So on the one hand, parents like Alex noted that videos of George Floyd and social media gave families reasons to talk about racism and race. And Betty also said that just her and her husband's emotional reaction to the news had brought up the conversations. Their children were a little bit younger and maybe a little harder to talk to about this. So it's kind of an ongoing conversation. And of course, Breonna Taylor, and I think it was probably because T and I were just watching so much news and just, very emotional about it all, that they needed to have conversations with their children. So we've seen that these conversations come up because of incidents at school, because children ask questions, and because of the media that's entering the house, right, and the events in the world that are happening. Betty also noted, she was an attorney, that this should not be her burden. The burden is on you too, because your white sons and daughters will perhaps have to bear witness for my children and maybe protect them, or maybe speak out for them, And so these parents shared their stories and strategies with us. One major finding to emerge was that they had proactive parenting styles that involved working to reduce racism in their child's environment at school and in community. And when I shared some of this data with one of my friends who works in the juvenile detention centers in Memphis, she was like, what a great thing that Maya in particular was doing by calling the chief of police in every town where her son was, to be proactive. And she's like, we should launch a hashtag campaign, what's his name, to kind of, meet the needs of children rather than after the fact, right? So Maya's proactive strategy of calling the police in white communities where her son would be walking or attending events just demonstrates a need for proactive anti-racist actions from all citizens to know our neighbors and advocate for children. So, and this was one of the things that we had thought of. So one of the things I'd like to do next is kind of gather the mothers together again and think about how we can work together in these kinds of campaigns. And then I'm gonna let Daryl conclude.
Thank you. So in conclusion, we found that race socialization is often a narrative process, motivated by family external events and children's questions. The data from these parents has implications for all families of color who face racism. Further research will consider the role of race socialization and racism in relation to African American language use at home. Now here I must kind of insert myself in what I'm working on. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Memphis, working on my own dissertation. And so this study that we have conducted, it actually ties into my own dissertation, covering the family language policy of African Americans within the city of Memphis and surrounding Shelby County areas. In my dissertation, I'm aiming to actually explore the societal stigma of African American language usage. Through my interviews, I too have found that racism and race often influence parents' use of language at home and how they decide when and how to use it with their spouses or co-parents and their children. We would like to give special acknowledgement to the University of Memphis College of Arts and Science Research Grant Fund. This support does not necessarily imply endorsements by the University of Research Conclusions, but we would also like to give a thanks to the parents who shared their personal stories with us, and also a colleague of mine who goes by the name of Badu, who also assisted in some of the research.
And Phoenix Matthews and Sister Niece.
Yes. So thank you all for attending our talk. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions at all? Comments?
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting this. It's really powerful. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about kind of how the dynamics worked of the, I mean, you kind of talked about, of course, it matters who does the interview, so I'm kind of wondering, like, could you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how did it pan out, like, you know, whoever wanted to specifically interview with Lynn and that sort of thing? I just was curious, if you had anything more to say about that?
Yeah, so one participant actually requested to interview with Lynn personally, but we felt that the others will feel more comfortable talking to an interviewer who looked more like them, since all of them are African-American parents, so that's kind of where I came in on the study. And one actually stated on her own that it would have impacted her answers if she were being interviewed by a white person.
So I think it brings up two things. One, Daryl is a new researcher, so we did 2 interviews together to get him started and make sure he felt he could do it, and he was great. The second thing I think when I put that quote up from that parent is what are the ethics around doing an interview with an African American interviewer but presenting it to a white audience. And so that is something that I am thinking about and how we represent and talk about the conversation that occurred. And I don't have an answer for that. It's just something that I am aware of. Yeah.
So this is great. I think this is really a wonderful project. I don't know, Lynn, if you were at the PAEC meeting on Sunday. It's the outreach.
Yeah, unfortunately I
social
wasn't,
justice.
but yeah.
I mean, one of the things that they are trying to organize is training for writing op-eds, because I think this kind of research needs to go beyond this white audience
Yeah.
to a broader white audience.
Yeah.
And so I think it's fantastic, and I hope you find ways to do
Thank
that.
you. Yeah, so we have been asked to write a AAAL brief on this presentation, so we will be doing that. And my goal really, so my next plan with Daryl is to organize a conference at University of Memphis, so more news on that later on language, race, and education. And then also just really mobilizing this group of women who participated, because they're so highly educated and activists who don't maybe have the time or aren't, connected in the, this academic setting, to think about how can we kind of raise the profile of this topic and bring it to school teachers, because there needs to be this, we need to be talking about this, but it's very difficult to ask school teachers to think about how to work it into a curriculum or make it a part of everyday conversation. So that's something of the future, eventually. And then Daryl's research, I think, will also add another layer of, thinking about language itself. Yeah.
I would love to hear more about your participant recruitment, because I think that, it was just interesting to see the people who, responded to the flyers that you.
Yeah, we made a flyer and distributed in different ways, such as social media and through email.
Yeah, I can imagine that, many folks just may not have time or think of themselves as called to be somebody to talk to with experts, right?
Yeah.
And I just wonder if you have any plans to expand, sort of possibly your reach to people who may also have lots of really interesting, perspectives to share in this area.
Well, I was really glad that we had an upper middle class, highly educated pool, because that is not the voice we typically hear in research. And so, research, so I think that's important. It was really hard to recruit for this study because of the time, right? And it was a really heavy topic, right? So I think that I had more research participants cry during an interview than I've ever had, and I needed a lot of time, and I don't know about how Daryl felt. I think just after the interviews to kind of process, so it took us a long time. I was slow to recruit. I think that I had a connection. I knew someone at a school, and that was kind of our main connection. So she agreed to participate, and then she had sent it to other people. So that network was important. I'm not sure that we got many people from the public notices Daryl also has a very strong fraternity network, and I think we got a few people that way.
I was going to mention that as well. Yes, a lot of people from the Greek community, Black Greek-led organizations, they were rather interested in participating, but some were concerned since they held such a high socioeconomic status that what they were saying would impact their job, and so they kind of made them hold back on some of the things that they were stating in the interviews.
It was a difficult process. We have 2 more interviews that we haven't analyzed, so they'll go into the study. There was one more thing I was going to say, but when I reached out to the Boys and Girls Club, and I also think I emailed sorority presidents, they were very enthusiastic. So I do think that there is interest in participating. It's just, the process of getting people to participate. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was also wondering about, I know that this is a very emotional issue, and it's something that you talked about building trust between the interviewer and the interviewee, and so have you thought about doing group interviews? Is that something where, I'm not an interviewer myself, so this is more a methodological question, to help me.
Yeah, I mean, some kind of focus group, or bringing people together in a way that would feel less one-on-one or threatening, maybe. I've thought about doing that at this stage, maybe asking the moms who did, there was one dad, I keep saying moms, to asking the participants if they would want to meet and maybe think about next steps, and really looking more at the allyship literature that's been talked about during this weekend, and thinking about how to move forward in a very collaborative kind of participant-led way. And so that might be a place where it could be a little more of a common goal with work associated.
I was thinking with the Greek life, there's already a shared sense of community and trust there.
Yeah.
So that sounded like it might be a fit.
So, I mean, one of the things I wanted to say at AAAL is that I don't think that these topics are limited to African American parents. I think that I work primarily in the field of multilingual parenting and family language policy. We never talk about racism in that field, but I know that the parents make choices or have language ideologies that are related to the racism that they face outside of the home. And so one of the things I want, one of the messages I want to bring is that this is something that parents talk about and deal with, and it can really affect the language use at home, right? And so we don't have those studies yet, but that is another direction that we could go in altogether. Anyone else? Questions or comments? Well, we really appreciate you coming, and thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. I know we're all probably